This video is going to be a follow-up of something that I said a few months ago. It was probably around maybe the beginning of February 2023, and it was a lesson that was in our series on God's appointed feasts, or the biblical holidays. Now, in that particular lesson, we were talking about the Passover, the final meal that Jesus had with his disciples, what we call the Last Supper. But it's in the context of a Passover celebration. And then after the meal, the Bible tells us they went to a place called Gethsemane. And it was there we were talking about what's going on with Jesus, what's happening, how it still relates to the Passover celebration, and then how can we understand it's actually quite a difficult passage, particularly when we think about the divinity of Jesus. The way the passage is found, people struggle with it because it's Jesus in his humanity. He's in the fullness of humanity and he's struggling with what's going on. Now, when we were talking about that, I hit on a verse, and it's in Luke, and we'll talk about that tonight, about sweat being like great drops of blood. Now, it was here that I pointed out that the text does not say that Jesus was actually sweating blood. That's an interpretation. And I think, and many other scholars do as well, it's a faulty one. And this is what we're going to do tonight in this short video. And I know this is part of Fig Tree 5 or Fig Tree 5-ish. It's definitely longer than 5 minutes, but I need to provide the background and some of the symbolism to the verse, so you can understand why I said that there actually wasn't any blood, okay? Now, when I put this out, it's a contentious topic, and I understand that. And I did get some pushback from one viewer who, like many Christians, I understand that at some point they've been told or made to believe, or they maintain a belief that Jesus did sweat blood. It's an emotional topic. And I do not mean in any way, I don't intend in any way for anyone to be upset. If I did that unnecessarily, I apologize. But I want to make sure you understand where I'm coming from. If you've ever been on discussion boards, like there are websites where you can, just ask a question about a Bible verse and then people debate the answers, and this is really a popular one. And what seems to happen is about half the people commenting, well, they're adamant that Jesus did in fact sweat blood. And I do understand there's a medical condition where this phenomenon does happen, where blood will get into the sweat glands. And then as they perspire, it's blood coming out. So I do know that that's a medical condition. But on the other side of the argument, the people who are counter to that, and this is what I'm going to say tonight, they're just going to simply say, look, the text doesn't tell us that. There's a word in the text. The word is like. And we'll see that word like, well, it creates a simile, a comparison. And I even attended a church back when I was a new believer. This was 20 years ago. And the pastor there would regularly insist that Jesus did sweat blood, and that Luke knew all about this because he was a doctor and so on, and he would insist on this. And then I would go read my Bible and I would think, that's not what it says. And perhaps it was because I was older and I was new to it and I was examining everything that was said about Christianity. I read the text and I thought, that's not it. And so now that I actually, back then, I didn't have the time or the tools to do all the research that I do today. But it never sat right with me because the verse that we're going to look at, doesn't say that happened. Okay. So there's going to be 3 things I want to show you, and why this is so important that we understand, that we get the interpretation correct. There's a doctrine of inerrancy, that the biblical text is inerrant. I agree with that. One problem is that our interpretations of what the text means are very often errant. It's part of the mission. Why would you have a Bible education ministry like Fig Tree Ministries if you didn't think that you were going to be able to help people correct some of the errors that have built up over time? Okay, so the 3 things we're going to look at tonight that's going to help us understand what's going on in that verse in Luke is the first one is we're going to look at the verse in Luke. It's Luke 22:44. And we're going to see that it's a comparison. We're going to slow down, make sure we read the verse correctly. What does it tell us? Well, it's making a comparison. The second part is that there's a theological idea that existed in the first century, and we could call it first Adam, last Adam. And of course, Jesus being the last Adam. Now, we'll go over this. We're going to go over how the story and what Luke says relates to this concept. It's very deep, and it's a profound way of looking at what Jesus is doing. And then finally, what we need to understand is that the word sweat, when you see the word sweat in the ancient world, that was used as an idiom for anxiety. Now, an idiom, it's an expression in which the words that you see in the expression, well, that they mean something else, right? The meaning of the phrase is not inherently deducible from the words in the phrase. So, for instance, we might say somebody bought the farm. And what does that mean? Well, in America, in our Western world, that's an idiom, maybe even a euphemism for death. But the words in the idiom don't have anything to do with death, right? So you could say, it's raining cats and dogs. Now, if someone had written down, it's raining cats and dogs, would you say, literally, it was raining cats and dogs? Cats and dogs are falling from the sky? Well, no, of course not. Simply means it's raining hard. You know, you can see how confusing idioms are when you interact with another culture if you're not familiar with that idiom. And in the ancient Near East, particularly ancient Israel, our Old Testament and even into the New are full of idiomatic phrases. And if you don't know that, you can often get the interpretation wrong because you're missing what they're saying. Okay? We're missing the meaning that goes along with that idiomatic phrase because the words, you can't figure it out from the words. So I think what's going to happen is as we go through this in this lesson, that you'll be able to see in the text of Luke something different, right? As we slow down and look at the symbolism and the idiomatic expression, that you'll see the passage of Luke different than you did before. And that happens all the time in Bible study. So I think that's going to happen tonight. So we'll start right now with Luke 22, verse 44. This is the verse in question that we're going to wrestle with tonight. And I'm pulling this from the New Heart English Bible. Of course, this is when he's at the Gethsemane, or like John says, he's in a garden. And you'll have to watch that whole video on the Garden of Gethsemane. So it says, being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Now, I'm going to come back to this word agony in a minute because there's something more expressive about that word that we need to understand that helps us understand this whole phrase. Here's the point in question. His sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. And the operative word right here is like. And so what we can see is that the main subject here is Jesus's sweat. And then the like, and I know I'm going through this slowly, the like creates a comparison. It was like great drops of blood, and then further falling down on the ground. And now the word like creates a simile. And similes compare things that have something in common but aren't otherwise alike. So something in common, both sweat and blood come out of the body. But on the other hand, they're different. They're entirely different. So sweat and blood don't act the same. They don't fall the same. They don't come out of the body the same. And what it looks like is happening here is that the simile that's being used by Luke, the comparison, is to add emphasis to the sweating, which we'll get to why is he doing that. So the phrase, like great drops of blood that are falling on the ground, well, it adds an intensity to the sweat. And you have to notice We notice what's written in the text, but what's not written in the text. Luke could have very easily just said, Jesus began to sweat blood. And he doesn't do that. So he's using that simile to intensify the sweat. Now, I'll give you a personal example. This just happened a few weeks ago. So I'm just laying down on the living room floor, and I'm take my iPhone because I need to look something up, and I'm flipping through my iPhone. Now I'm holding my iPhone right above my face. So if you're going to get anything out of this lesson, don't lay on the living room floor with your iPhone above your face. So I'm flipping through the iPhone, and of course it slips. And the way it fell, the corner of the iPhone went sideways, and it hit my lip right at the tooth. Now, within seconds, I mean, a second or two, I could feel the blood both running into my mouth and on my chin, and I wiped my chin, and there's blood all over my chin. Because blood falls or comes out of you different than sweat. And so by the time I got into the kitchen to grab a towel, I've got blood, drops of blood are falling on my shirt, drops of blood are falling on the floor. And so anybody, even if you've just sliced your hand with a knife at some point, you could see you're making a trail of drops of blood on your way to the bathroom in a way that sweat doesn't fall that way. So sweat tends to stay on the skin. Now, you could be really sweaty, but the point is that's the comparison. His sweat was like great drops of blood falling, because great drops of blood fall different than sweat. That's the comparison. So sometimes we just have to slow down a little bit, break down these verses to make sure that we're reading it correctly. And this actually is a problem for modern Christians. I find it all the time when we're reading our Bible. The tendency is to go too fast, and then we can read things into the text that are not there because we already have a belief in our mind. Now, what I want to get to, though, is there's a big question here. Why is Luke even telling us this, right? Why mention the sweat? Why mention the sweat falling like great drops of blood? And that's going to bring us to something that's very deep. It's theologically profound, and it's this idea of the first Adam and the last Adam. So the first Adam and the last Adam, it's a theological idea. It comes out of Judaism, first century Judaism. We know it's there. So we know it's there prior to Jesus. And we see it then show up in the New Testament as an explanation of Jesus as the Messiah, what his mission is, what he's accomplishing in the cosmos. And the idea, well, it's a bit of a thought experiment. It goes something like this. What if that very first Adam, that's the Adam of Adam and Eve back in Genesis, what if that Adam had not failed? What if that Adam had not sinned? Well, he wouldn't have been banished from the garden. And he wouldn't have been banished from the garden, and sin and death, that wouldn't have entered the world. And if sin and death didn't enter the world, well, we have no need for redemption. We have no need for a Messiah, the one that will bring about redemption. So if the first Adam had never left the garden, then in some sense he's his own redeemer because he kept himself there. If he had never left, we have no need for God's plan of redemption to be unfolding and to bring about the Messiah. And so the idea was this, because Paul tells us in Romans 5, he says that this first Adam is a pattern of what will come, and that what will come is the last Adam. And so the thought was kind of like, well, look, if the first Adam was the one that failed, then the last Adam, he's going to be the one who doesn't fail, who maintains what God had originally intended, who doesn't sin. He's going to be the Savior who's able to reverse the curse that was brought about by the first Adam. So Jesus, in his obedience to God, all the way up to the point of death, then reverses the curse of the first Adam. Jesus is the last Adam. So read Romans 5, it's verses 12 to 21. He talks about sin and death entering the world through one man, and then how righteousness and life come through the last Adam, or that second man, that's Jesus. Now, he doesn't use the exact phrase, first Adam, last Adam. He does in Corinthians, but not there in Romans, but the concept is there. And you have to notice that Paul doesn't stop to explain it to his intended audience in Rome. And Paul, at that point, he had never been to Rome. So it's not like he has this idea that he would have taught them and then is reminding them about it. It's a concept that they would already be familiar with. And then Paul is using that to help them understand who Jesus is or what Jesus is accomplishing. And sometimes, I find with us Western Christians, at least, because this is not so much the case the further east you go, but in Western Christianity, because we're more scientifically minded, we often would love our Bible to be like a textbook, so that when Paul brings up a concept like first Adam and last Adam, that he goes into a detailed explanation and then shows you where, 9 out of 10 theologians surveyed agree and all this data that backs it up. That's like a text. That's what we love to read. We love to have all of that information, laying it out in a methodical manner. But Paul doesn't do that. And very often he'll say, I'm here to tell it to you plainly. And then the next sentence the next sentence on the paper, it's like, what are you talking about, Paul? So what we have to remember is they had all of these concepts in place. And Paul is just using the metaphors that they all know to help them understand something about Jesus. Now, another place that Paul does this, same metaphor, is in 1 Corinthians 15, and you can go read that. He's weaving together these deep metaphors about the cosmos and resurrection. But we see him in 1 Corinthians 15:45, and he's directly using the term first Adam, last Adam. Now, we also find this in the Gospel of John. John is retelling the creation story from Genesis, it's why he starts his gospel with the phrase, in the beginning. It takes you right back to Genesis 1. And then John has his gospel laid out as 7 signs, like the 7 days of creation. And then at the very end, it's John who says Jesus was in the garden. That's where we get the Garden of Gethsemane, because John mentions garden. But John has a theological purpose. He's putting Jesus in the garden just like the first Adam. Now, John's the only one who does that. He's the only one to mention the word garden. But he's got a theological purpose to doing that. And so John's focus is that the last Adam, Jesus did not fail in the garden, and because of that not failing, all creation is born again. It's renewed. And so you step off at the end of John into that first day of the week as if all creation has been born again. Okay, and so we also find this reference to first Adam, last Adam here in Luke. But the thing is, he doesn't really say it. It comes with the idea of the sweat and wrestling with that anxiety in the garden and the obedience to God. So this takes us to our next piece, which is this idea of sweat as an idiom for anxiety. And this is going to actually connect us directly back to the first Adam within Luke. And I'll show you a few examples in a second. In ancient literature, sweat does not mean the result of physical exertion like we think today. When the word sweat is used in ancient documents, it concerns anxiety. So let me show you something significant first. It has to do with the word sweat in the Bible. So the first thing we notice is that in the New Testament, there's only one time that the word sweat shows up in the New Testament. It's this verse right here, Luke 22:44. Now, when there's a word that's rarely used in the Bible, you want to look at the places it's used and see if you can make a comparison. Well, if we go to the Old Testament, because there's only one use of sweat in the New Testament, and we go to the Old Testament, we find there's one use of sweat in the Old Testament. It's Genesis 3:19. And so what you can get is a comparison. The first Adam to the last Adam. And this, we're not trained to read our Bible this way. We're not trained to think about our Bible this way. But Jesus was. And there's a technique that the rabbis use. It's called Gezerah Shavah. What it means is when you find a word that's hardly used twice, you say those two probably have the same meaning, right? Two verses with a word that's not used very often probably have the same meaning. And that's why, so when someone comes up to Jesus and says, "What's the greatest commandment?" asking for one commandment, he gives them two. How can he connect those? Because he's using that technique. There's a word in there that those two commandments share that you don't find very often in the Old Testament. So this becomes a significant thing in the way that we can connect Luke back to Genesis, back to that first Adam. That's how we know it's first Adam, last Adam. Okay, so let's look then at the Old Testament and sweat. When we consider the Old Testament, it's always important because we want to look at what the original context, and this is an ancient document. So in order to do that, we have to look at the writings that come from the cultures that surround Israel. Not an easy task. I know most people don't have time to go do that, but there are scholars who devote their whole life to doing that, and it helps us understand the text. So for instance, here's an article. I think you can find this on academia.com. It's a place where scholars will upload their work, and then you're able to access it. This is an article by Daniel Fleming. Daniel Fleming, he's a professor of Hebraic and Judaic studies at New York University, and he's also an expert on ancient Near East literature. And so this article, it details his research into the word sweat throughout the body of ancient Near East literature. And what he found was, any time the word sweat is used, it does not have to do with physical exertion or labor, but with anxiety. And so you could say, sweat is an ancient idiom for anxiety. So when you see the word sweat, you have to read anxiety. Okay? And then his suggestion is, this is how we should be reading Genesis 3. And what's happening to Adam after he's eaten the fruit. Because Adam is going to be kicked out of the garden. He has to enter the reality of the world. He's no longer in paradise. And part of the curse that humanity feels is our expanded awareness of our movement through time and history. We have an awareness of the past, but we can't change the past. We can be forgiven of the past. That's part of the forgiveness that God, so that we can go move forward into the future, freed up from those burdens of shame or guilt or regret. But we have an awareness that we have a past, and we have an awareness of the future, but we do not have the agency to deal with the future or know all the information. So it becomes a burden. It's our awareness of the future. And anxiety, by the way, well, anxiety is all about a nebulous, unknown future. That's anxiety. So this is what this little article is about. I'll put a link to the website where you can find it below. But let's read Genesis 3 now and think about what this means by the sweat of your brow or the sweat of your face. So I'm going to look at Genesis 3. It's 17 to 19. I'll look at some portions of it. So in verse 17, this is really key to notice. God curses the ground. God curses the ground, but not Adam. He never curses Adam. The result coming out of the garden feels like a curse on humanity. All God did was move humanity out of the garden, and now we have to deal with reality as such. But he does curse the ground, and that's going to make work difficult at first. And then when we get down, we'll read verse 19 a little differently. So he says, because you have listened to your wife's voice, and you've eaten of the tree which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. So the ground isn't always going to cooperate with you like it does here in paradise. And now, in toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. So there, we're working hard on the ground, and the ground's not cooperating with us. So there's no doubt there is hard work here. Thorns and thistles are going to grow, okay? But then we get to verse 19. And then it says this, by the sweat of your face will you eat bread. Okay, so we have the word sweat, and this is what we have to think about. By the sweat of your face will you eat bread until you return to the ground. And when we see that word sweat, what we have to do is read into it anxiety. And this is what the verse is telling us. With anxiety, you will eat your food. Right? And anxiety, it's all about the future. I have food today, but what's going to happen tomorrow? I don't know. And I can't control it. And so it's a nebulous future. You don't have enough information. Anxiety, by the way, is not fear. Fear is right now. Fear is what's happening right now. Anxiety might be, yeah, I'm thinking about my house catching fire and how I would react, like performance anxiety. Would I know what to do? Fear is the house is on fire, get out or try to put it out. And you know immediately what you need to do. You can act. But now with anxiety, you can't act on anxiety because nothing is happening yet. It's often a nebulous future. You don't have all the details you need, right? Is there going to be a war? Is there going to be a nuclear war? What'll happen, right? Is my city going to be targeted? How am I going to be able to deal with this? Would I be able to perform if there was a nuclear attack? On the other hand, if bombs are coming in, meaning now it's fear because it's actually happening, well, you do something and you act, you duck and cover. This is how we go through life, right? What if I lose my job? What if the market crashes? What if my investment doesn't turn out the way that I expected it to? What's going to happen with my kids when they grow up? What's going to happen, blah, 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 what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen? And because we don't have the agency nor the ability to know the future, that's anxiety. And it's a curse. We're aware of a future. We're aware of our past. Forgiveness can release us from that. But we don't know enough about that future. So that's what this verse is saying. With anxiety, you will eat. I got food today. And think about what a farmer, every day the farmer, am I going to get enough rain? Or are we going to get too much rain? Is it going to come at the right time? What if the locusts come? Or what if there's a beetle that wipes out my crop? Or there are 1,000 things that can go wrong with the farmer. And there's always a bit of anxiety about what's going to happen in the future if the food's going to come in and then the money's going to come in. It's that awareness of the future. Now, what I want to do, though, is I want to move. This is ancient. This is very old document. I want to move something that's closer to the New Testament because we want to ask, is that idiom of sweat still relevant in Luke's New Testament writing as it was back here in Genesis? And the answer is, of course, yes. So I'm going to give you 2 examples of this. And I don't have time to go into who these people are, but take the time and you can Google them and you'll find them. The first one, Philo of Alexandria. He's a 1st century writer. He's writing in the time of Jesus, born about 20 BC, died at 50 AD. So he's alive during the time of Jesus, lives in Alexandria, Egypt, prolific writer. And what's going to happen is he's going to relate a story, true story, about the Roman Emperor Caligula. Now, if you know Caligula, you know he's a madman, right? Totally crazy, terrorized people throughout his reign. And what Caligula had decided is that he's going to place a statue of him, right? Now get this, a statue of him as the Roman god Jupiter inside the temple in Jerusalem. And so many people don't know, there was a cult. It's called the imperial cult. It's emperor worship. You worship the emperor as a deity because he alone controls the chaos and order in the world. Just like the Pharaoh said that he did. So Caligula makes this decision that he's going to put a statue of himself inside the temple of Jerusalem, while the religious elders said no way. They go out ahead of it and they're going to try to stop it. And they're going to say, look, you're going to have to kill us in order to get this done. Now, you can read about this. It's called the writing, Philo's writing is called On the Embassy to Gaius. It's between the way they number the verses or the way they number the sections, 229 to 243, you'll find the whole discussion. But the religious leaders, they're pleading their case to the general who's bringing this statue to Jerusalem. They're pleading their case to not desecrate the temple. But the reality is they're facing certain death if they resist. And that's what they tell him. You're going to have to kill us before you put that in the temple. And to Caligula, they were just a speed bump in his way. But we want to notice, though, that Philo is going to mention sweat. Now, it's not because they're performing hard work. It's the excessive sweat of having to face death, right? The worst anxiety there is called death anxiety. That's the one that frightens people the most. So he says this. He writes, "This appeal was made in great agitation and intense emotion." Then he says, "And there was sweat streaming over every limb." Okay? Now, the point, it's the intensity of the emotion, right? What's going to happen? Are we going to die tomorrow? Are we walking into certain death? And this is what Jesus is doing, right? He's fully in his humanity that night at the Gethsemane. He's sharing all of our emotions. His anxiety level is through the roof as he's getting closer to the realization that he's going to not only die, but the wrath of God that's supposed to be poured out on the world for the sin is going to be poured out on him. How's he going to be able to handle that? Right? How would your anxiety be as that realization intensifies? So it's much more about the emotion than it is physical work, okay? Now, happy end, well, not happy ending for Caligula, but thankfully what happened was Caligula died. He was actually assassinated prior to this taking place. So everybody was spared. The statue actually never made it to Jerusalem, but I think you get the point. Now I'll show you one more. Again, these names are even more out there, but Philostratus, he's quoting now the words of a gentleman, Polemo, and Polemo is latter half of the 1st century, so about the time that Luke is writing. And Polemo, he's a sophist, a master of rhetoric, of speaking, and he's from the city of Laodicea. That's one of John's churches in the book of Revelation. So Philostratus is quoting Polemo, and I just want you to notice the context here, okay? When he saw the gladiator streaming with sweat, now, not because of the physical exertion of a gladiatorial match, but because it's in a contest for his life. He's dreading the contest for his life. Okay? Now, by the way, just so you know, Polemo is from Laodicea. Laodicea was a famous gladiator training school. So there's context here. He's talking with a gladiator, and he's at the place where there's a famous gladiator training school. So that makes sense. Okay, but look what Polemo says. He says, you are as anxious as though you were about to declaim. Now, I had to look that word up, declaim. So don't feel bad if you don't know it. It means you're about to have a speech, a speech of rhetoric. You're anxious like you're about to do some public speaking, right? But notice how we're connecting. Streaming with sweat is not from the fight. It's from the anxiety that's being induced because it's a contest for his life. Again, facing possible death here. And now you have sweat that comes into that picture and the idea of anxiety. Okay? Now, let's go back to Luke 22:44. Because there's one more piece to this. It says, being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. So being in agony. Now, I think every Bible translation here has agony. Perhaps it's anguish, but what is agony or what is anguish? Well, anguish is heightened anxiety that begins to affect your body. So anxiety underlies this. And the Greek word that we have here, it's the same Greek word that we just saw from Polemo. It can be translated as anxiety. So being in anxiety, he prayed more earnest, right? The anguish is intense anxiety where your body's reacting. How do we know this? Well, we have to go to, it's called the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, the TDNT. Okay? When we look up this word, it says it originally means inner tension or anxiety. And that's the word that we translated as agony. And most strictly, it indicates the supreme concentration of powers in the face of imminent decisions or disasters. So that's how we can understand being in anxiety. He prayed more earnestly. Why is Jesus experiencing such anxiety? Because he's now realizing the fate that's about to happen the next day. It's being in agony or being in anxiety, he prayed more earnestly. And the anxiety that exists because of the first Adam is now overcome by the last Adam, Jesus. Right? And so the picture is that Jesus is able to accomplish in the garden what the first Adam could not. He was obedient to God even up to the point of his death. And if you remember Jesus that night, he says something like, Father, if you can take this cup away from me, right? If there's any other way to do this, I would prefer that route. But if not, then your will be done. And then it's through that obedience that Jesus conquers that curse. And of course, God resurrects him from the dead. That's the defeat of death itself. He places Jesus at the right hand. Right now, think about that. Even the resurrection tells us that you don't have to be anxious about death. Death anxiety shouldn't hold power over you because there is an afterlife. So even all of that, the defeat of death, and God places Jesus at his right hand. He's the Lord of all. He's the judge of the cosmos. He's that last Adam. But notice, it's about anxiety, and then the sweat became like great drops of blood falling on the ground. Okay, so let's do a quick review. The first thing to notice, all you have to do is read Luke 22:44. You notice that word like, and that you notice the comparison. And you recognize that blood falls different than sweat. It intensifies the nature of the sweat, which is anxiety, and that's exactly what the sentence tells us. But why? Why do we need to know this? Well, it goes back to that theological idea of first Adam, last Adam, right? That Jesus is able to reverse the curse, and there's a new beginning. We're reborn in that. And of course, we talked about sweat as that idiom for anxiety, wherever you find that in the ancient world. And the fact that 2 times in the Bible you find sweat, and one is Jesus and one's the first Adam, and then you're like, okay, now that kind of puts me exactly where I need to be to understand what's going on with this sentence. And, you know, scholars throughout the years, early church fathers had a hard time with this verse because there's an angel attending Jesus. Why does an angel need to attend Jesus in this moment? Well, in the fullness of his humanity, he's feeling every bit of what's going on, every bit of anxiety. He's going to have to struggle with that, but then remain obedient to God. Okay, so Jesus did not sweat blood, and I hope this becomes clearer as we look at this more intently, and this is just how we have to study the Bible. We need to slow down, make sure that we're reading it correctly. You have to study the Bible with humility, because if you're if we want to get closer to Jesus, then we're going to have to do it in truth. And if we have an interpretation that's incorrect, because that's very possible, then we need to have some humility to say, hey, look, I got that wrong. I have new information now. I'm going to change the way that I view this so that we can get closer to the reality of what was going on in that first century, rather than just saying, well, I'm going to live with any old interpretation because I like that one. So hopefully this helps you with this fact of what was going on with Jesus in Luke 22:44.